If you went to Nashville today, you would see a lot of cultural objects that make absolutely no historical or geographical sense. Like, you're in Tennessee. Cowboy hats and cowboy boots have almost nothing to do with the local culture. And to the small extent that they do have something to do with local culture, they're much more closely associated with cultures hundreds of miles away. Well, it turns out that Nashville's association with cowboy culture comes through a long and convoluted pipeline, one sparked by the city's role as a key node in the culture industry, specializing in disseminating Disney World simulations of the Wild Wild West. Today, we're talking about one of the most grandiose relics of this era of the Western, an album which epitomizes the Nashville country establishment and its project for America, Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs by Marty Robbins. When old-time music moved west, it collided with a set of genres already popular in northern Mexico. Ranchera represented an early form of compact lyrical songwriting. Oftentimes, the structures were fairly simple, involving an A section of a bunch of instruments playing in unison, and a B section with a repeated lyrical chorus. Most importantly, it divided all of its songs into one of three meters: the polka, the waltz, and the bolero. The corrido, on the other hand, told a long, narrative, oftentimes romantic stories in a standardized poetic meter. This style is more closely tied to Spain, and it became a common form of oral communication. You could essentially think of it like a form of epic poetry. And it maintained mainstream popularity in Mexico all the way through World War II. New Mexican music, that is a form of northern Mexican music most closely associated with the US state of New Mexico, took more direct influences from the native peoples of the area, like the Puebloans and the Navajo. These bands sometimes included traditional instruments, like the Anasazi flute, and most distinctively, New Mexican music had an insistence on the steadiness of the beat, which runs counter to a lot of other kinds of American roots music, like blues music, which sits behind the beat, or bluegrass, which sits in front of the beat. Also in the New Mexican style, some of these other forms of Mexican music would be converted from sung parts to chants to more closely align with native traditions. And lastly, Tejano music brings influences from Central Europe into this existing concoction of Spanish and native influences. Specifically, this brought in the accordion. And this might be a style that you're more familiar with if you're American, because this style actually caught on pretty well in America. From here, it can be hard to parse the facts from the myth building in this oral history. But believe it or not, it is distinctly possible that the history of American Western music actually has close ties to real-life actual cowboys. I mean, think about it. Cowboys had a pretty lonely existence with plenty of silent time that they could fill with music. And some of these songs have these sporadic and dramatic calls and shouts that make more sense as a way to communicate with your cattle than as anything that makes any self-evident musical sense. The subtle use of the backbeat, along with brisk tempos and strict adherence to the meter, even if that meter was sometimes somewhat swung, calls to mind the gait of a horse. So yes, it can be easy to roll your eyes at the cowboy themes in some of these songs, but there's a fairly strong case to be made that some of these more traditional Western songs were actually transpositions of old-time songs that cowboys played in order to describe their actual real lives. This makes even more sense when you take into account the fact that cowboys were often Hispanic, Native, or Black, bringing in all of these influences together to create the heterodox form that we see in Western music today. And naturally, harmonicas made sense as an addition because they were easy to carry around on long cattle drives. But of course, the economic conditions that created cowboys would wipe them away just as quickly. And this very real local musical tradition would charge headfirst into an era intent on commercializing everything about the American West. And Western movies would become top sellers in Hollywood starting in the 1930s. Now, in the context of the Great Depression, it makes sense that people would be fascinated with Westerns. Those lives lived on the pasture lands, even if they were far from perfect, were a stark contrast to the distinct brand of urban corporate hell brought forth by the Great Depression. But even as conditions improved, Americans would remain obsessed with this form of imagery, proving that the American desire for self-reliance would remain unstoppable, even in an era of increased interconnectivity and interdependence. Unsurprisingly, the true story of the American West includes a cross-section of people who were chewed up and spit out by the rest of American society. People of marginalized races and sexualities. People run out of their hometowns due to antisocial behavior. People desperately poor and willing to till an acre of sand until they starve to death rather than continue renting land from the same neo-plantation owners back home. And that representation we're sold through the movies may as well be the opposite of all of this. White Americans in the movies get portrayed as an uncritically civilizing force, sidestepping all conversations of colonialism in favor of the hero's journey, a straightforward story of a man doing what is right as others cower in fear and bringing order to a one-dimensional world. This is the story we as Americans have to tell ourselves in order to keep ourselves from going insane. It's what we do instead of staring tearing down the history of random disordered violence, extreme material hardship, and the constant abuse of systemic power. So Americans obviously loved the Westerns, and the music, unsurprisingly, came up with the rising tide. These songs would get a more professional look, with expanded vocal harmonies, cleaner delivery, and simpler themes. Essentially, this music started to much more closely resemble the movies than the reality that those movies were initially created to represent. In both the fields of movies and music, Western culture got commandeered by people who never touched the life of cowboys or ranchers, and oftentimes never lived in the rural American West at all. There were, of course, bands full of people who really used to be cattle ranchers, but those would all be swept away in favor of artists that we may now refer to as industry plants. And so this music, which once conveyed stories of the hardship of a real working class profession, would become easy listening music for movie scores. And so if we were to divide everyone into these worker and movie star categories, Marty Robbins would definitely stand more in that poser movie star class. He was born in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona in 1925. Though he didn't grow up particularly wealthy, he did grow up with a suburbanized, settled lifestyle with comforts unimaginable to the cowboys he would go on to sing about. His appreciation for Western storytelling seems to come from his grandfather, who by all accounts seemed to be the quintessential Western scumbag, teller of tall tales and supposed doer of all kinds of impressive feats. But that's not to say that Robbins had particularly cynical reasons to take up an interest in Western music. In fact, far from it. The guy seemed to really believe in the stuff. In fact, he seemed deeply interested in everything Americana, and he would go on to be a shockingly accomplished NASCAR driver later on in his life. However, it's worth mentioning that whatever tiny sliver of connection he may have had to the cowboys he would sing about, he almost certainly had even less of a connection to the moonshine smuggling Appalachians he was emulating when he got behind the wheel of his NASCAR. And there wasn't even anything particularly unique about his musical style. He was just especially good at channeling that American fascination with the West. He would become the sort of staple of the Nashville music industry that those hippie Americana types would rebel against later on. And he was a forerunner to the types of personalities we see on stage today at places like the CMA Awards. In short, Robbins wasn't a cowboy, he wasn't a booze smuggler, and he wasn't an outlaw. He was an exceptionally talented fictional storyteller who was sent to fight in World War II from his suburban home, and he would die a McCarthyist, far-right, anti-communist multi-millionaire. In short, everything we see here is simulated Western music, the type of music you would create if your only real knowledge of the West came from stories mostly told in movies and novels. All that goes to say, this album is fantastic. Well, I mean, everything I just said about it is also true, but there's no better way to learn about this moment of American obsession with Westerns. The album was released in 1959, right at the peak of uncritical American chauvinism and American fascination with Westerns in film and music. The songwriting credits here are a mix. Some of them are from Robbins or other contemporary Nashville sound non-cowboys, but some of the songs on here were credited to genuine first-wave Western cowboys, and a few others are so old that they weren't actually able to find a writer to credit at all, and those songs were almost certainly written by people who drove cattle. But it's important to note that the album's two most famous songs, Big Iron and El Paso, were both written by Robbins. If you were to go in listening to this without knowing that it's a mix of older and newer songs, you might not actually notice the difference. And that's because of the converging forces of Robbins' intense sanitization of these older songs and his deep efforts to make his new songs sound as if they were traditional. Everything here is washed in an iridescent polish, with perfect barbershop harmonies, laid-back guitar, and perfect insistence on the beat. And it's all overlaid with these lead vocals, which are deeply melancholic but disturbingly stoic at the same time. Despite this album's badass aesthetic, most of the songs on here that actually depict violence are the most one-dimensional stories possible of an outlaw meeting justice. What we know about every outlaw in the story is that they've killed several people, and all we see from the endings is them getting gunned down by vigilantes. To be fair, he tells stories from both the perspective of the vigilante and the outlaw, but that doesn't change the ending. It is crucial for you to understand how much this guy, who made a career off of being hard and badass, loved law and order, even in all of his most violent songs. A few other songs here actually do address some of the struggles of the Western life, but they do so in the most oblique and unserious ways possible. Like, yeah, there's a song about being thirsty, there's a song about being bucked off a horse, but it's nothing you wouldn't feel comfortable telling like a 4-year-old. And you know, They just had to put this in there. Even at the most chauvinistic, most pro-Western time of American culture, people just wouldn't quite believe it if their lives were absolutely perfect. But though most of the album is fairly one-dimensional, there are two songs that break that one-dimensionality in really interesting and different ways. El Paso was the breakout hit from the album, and it gives us the only example of a Robbins-written song that gives the criminal a backstory and an actual sympathetic character. Now, the narrator still kills somebody who is portrayed as uncritically worse than himself and is killed by a mob as a result. So, you know, the super bad guy is killed by the less bad guy, but you still gotta kill the less bad guy. I mean, he's still bad. That's what you do. You kill the bad guy. But this simple juvenile revenge fantasy just drips in this earnesty that makes everything so fascinating. I mean, if you were to divorce this song from its juvenile context, you hear a ballad that takes itself so seriously, just showing that Robbins really believed in the Western as a powerful storytelling medium. On the other hand, Utah Carol is one of the oldest, most traditional songs on the album. It's one of the ones I talked about that we can't find a writer to credit because it was almost certainly written by actual cowboys. And its treatment of Western life is much more tragic, complicated, and randomly cruel than anything else we find on this album. The good guy dies in this story for absolutely no reason. He just makes random mistakes that lead to extreme misfortune, and at no point does he commit any kind of obvious social transgression. And for the first time on the album, death is seen as tragic by somebody who is not directly involved in the incident. It's not just a spectacle to gawk at as a bystander, it's something that could actually happen to somebody you care about. Everywhere we look on this album, we find a con man, one whose genuine belief in his own product almost makes him a victim to his own con. He imprisons a genuinely meaningful story and cultural history inside a commercialized package, and that story yearns for a freedom that it would never see again. Americans bought into this con at unprecedented levels, buying into this fairy tale of their society as a chivalrous, honorable one full of rugged individualists. For decades, from the 1930s to the 1970s, America's ruling class understood this fantasy as fantasy, a fable which they obviously benefited from promoting, but one which they should never take into account when they're actually managing the country. Starting in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, the Western, and specifically the type of poser epitomized by Marty, took explicit power in the United States. From the 80s to the 2020s, the fictional America ruled us semi-covertly. It was right there for anyone critical enough to notice, but you could skate by without ever thinking about it. But today's politics directly abandon. They directly and openly suggest that the United States should be altered to fit these fictional media properties, taking us on a schizophrenic abandonment of material reality and creating a form of government that prioritizes the id at the expense of everything else.